It was the third week of November 2009, and the small resort town of Honor, Michigan had already seen its first heavy snowfall of the season, the kind that muffled sound and erased footprints within hours. Adrienne Wintall, a 32-year-old botanical illustrator from Ann Arbor, had rented a cabin along the western edge of Platte River for what she called a creative retreat. She told her sister it would be 5 days of sketching, silence, and no distractions. The cabin sat a quarter-mile off County Road 706, accessible only by a gravel drive that snaked through white pine and birch. It belonged to a retired orthopedic surgeon named Marlon Vess, who rented it seasonally through a handwritten listing posted at the Honor General Store. No website, no deposit, just cash and a signed waiver acknowledging the lack of internet, plumbing beyond a well pump, and emergency services more than 20 minutes away in good weather. Adrienne arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-November. The last confirmed sighting was at Beulah Fuel and Feed, a combination gas station and bait shop 3 miles south of the cabin. Security footage showed her purchasing firewood, 2 gallons of kerosene, a bag of apples, and a paperback mystery novel. She wore a gray wool peacoat and a knit cap with a small embroidered cardinal on the brim. As she left, she waved at the cashier, a woman named Darlene Kopp, who later described her as calm, cheerful, and looking forward to the quiet. That footage, time-stamped 3:47 p.m. on November 17th, would become the most replayed piece of evidence in the case file for the next decade. Marlon Vess expected Adrienne to return the cabin key by Sunday morning at the latest. When she didn't, he assumed the weather had delayed her. Snow had been falling steadily since Thursday, and the gravel drive was notorious for becoming impassable. He waited until Monday, then drove his pickup as close as the terrain allowed, before hiking the rest of the way on foot. When he reached the cabin just after noon, he found the door locked from the inside. He knocked, called her name, heard nothing. He used his spare key and stepped into silence. The interior was cold but undisturbed. A half-finished charcoal sketch of a winterberry branch sat on the small wooden table near the window. Her suitcase was open on the bed, clothes neatly folded inside. A mug of tea, long cold, rested on the counter beside the stove. Her boots were lined up by the door. Her coat hung from a wooden peg near the entry, but Adrienne was gone. Vess stepped outside and scanned the clearing. Fresh snow had blanketed everything overnight, erasing any trace of movement. No tire tracks leading out, no footprints heading toward the road or into the trees, just smooth white silence pressing in from all sides. He drove straight to the Benzie County Sheriff's Office and reported it that same afternoon. A search began immediately. Deputies, state troopers, a K-9 unit from Traverse City, and volunteers from the Honor Fire Department combed the woods within a 3-mile radius of the cabin. Helicopters swept the frozen riverbanks. Divers checked the deeper sections of Platte Lake despite the ice forming at the edges. For 9 days they found nothing. Not a scarf, not a glove, not a single sign she had ever left the cabin on foot. Adrienne's sister, Claire Wintall, flew in from Philadelphia and held a press conference at the county courthouse. She stood beside a blown-up photo of Adrienne smiling in a summer garden, her hands stained with charcoal and ink. Claire's voice cracked as she described her sister as kind, thoughtful, someone who sent handwritten birthday cards and remembered the names of every plant she ever drew. A $15,000 reward was offered by their parents, both retired teachers living in Kalamazoo. Tips came in sporadically. A hunter claimed he saw a woman matching her description walking near M22 the day after she disappeared, but the timeline didn't align. A psychic from Lansing called with coordinates that led to an abandoned deer blind. By early December, the search was scaled back, then suspended entirely. The cabin was locked again, and Adrienne Wintall's name was added to the Michigan State Police Missing Persons database. For nearly a decade, it stayed there. Then in February 2019, 2 brothers on snowmobiles cutting across state forest land near the northern boundary of Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore hit something under the snow. They stopped to investigate and found a canvas messenger bag partially frozen into the ice, its leather strap cracked and brittle from years of exposure. Inside were waterlogged pages from a sketchbook, a rusted tin of charcoal pencils, and a laminated library card with a name printed clearly across the front: Adrienne Wintall. The brothers, Lucas and Jeremy Toth, both lifelong residents of Empire, Michigan, recognized the name immediately. Their mother had been part of the original search crew back in 2009. They marked the GPS coordinates and drove straight to the ranger station at Philip A. Hart Visitor Center. Within 12 hours, the Benzie County Sheriff's Office reopened the case. Detective Warren Kulick, who had been a rookie deputy during the original investigation, was assigned lead. He remembered the case vividly, not just because of the strange disappearance, but because of how wrong it felt even then. No struggle, no signs of departure, but also no body. No explanation, just absence carved into winter. He requested the messenger bag be processed under the strictest forensic protocols available. Several pages in the sketchbook were too damaged to recover, but 3 near the center of the book were still legible. One showed a detailed pencil drawing of a winterberry branch, nearly identical to the unfinished sketch left on the cabin table. Another was dated November 19, 2009, 2 days after her arrival, and bore a single handwritten note in the margin. Someone knocked last night, didn't answer, stood outside for a long time. The third page, creased and torn along the edge, contained only 5 words written in hurried script. He knows I'm alone here. The discovery of Adrienne's messenger bag didn't just reopen a case file, it cracked open a wound that had never properly healed in the small towns surrounding Sleeping Bear Dunes. For the families who had searched those woods in 2009, for the volunteers who had walked grid patterns until their boots wore through, the bag represented something more than evidence. It was proof that she had been out there all along, somewhere beyond the perimeter they had drawn, beyond the assumptions they had made about how far a person could walk in a snowstorm without a coat. Detective Warren Kulick sat in the evidence room of the Benzie County Sheriff's Office on a gray February morning, the messenger bag laid out on a steel table under fluorescent light. He had requested the original case file be pulled from archives, and now 3 cardboard boxes sat stacked beside him, filled with interview transcripts, search maps, weather reports, and photographs of the cabin interior taken the day Marlon Vess reported Adrienne missing. Kulick opened the first box and began reading. The initial response had been swift and organized. Within 6 hours of Vess's report, a command center had been established at the Honor Township Hall. Search and rescue teams from 4 counties mobilized. The Michigan State Police deployed their aviation unit. Cadaver dogs were brought in from as far as Grand Rapids. But the search had been hampered from the start by weather and terrain. A blizzard moved through the region on November 23rd, dumping another 8 inches of snow and reducing visibility to near zero. The temperature dropped to 14 degrees Fahrenheit. Hypothermia became a real risk, not just for Adrienne, but for the searchers themselves. By November 28th, Thanksgiving weekend, the official search radius had expanded to nearly 6 square miles, covering dense forest, frozen wetlands, and sections of the Platte River, where the current ran fast enough to prevent ice from forming. Divers checked beneath the surface. Volunteers on horseback rode trails too narrow for ATVs, but nothing was found. Not a footprint preserved under a fallen branch, not a piece of torn fabric caught on barbed wire, not a single disturbance in the landscape that suggested she had passed through. The search coordinator at the time, a retired Marine named Gerald Foss, had written in his final report that the lack of evidence was statistically improbable, given the intensity and scope of the effort. He noted that in his 18 years coordinating wilderness rescues across northern Michigan, he had never encountered a case where a missing person left so little trace. He concluded with a line that Kulick underlined twice as he read it now. Either she was removed from the area by vehicle, or she never left the cabin on her own. Claire Wintall had stayed in Honor for 3 weeks after her sister disappeared, sleeping in a motel off US 31 and spending every daylight hour either at the command center or walking the woods herself. Kulick found her witness statement tucked into a manila folder near the bottom of the second box. She had described Adrienne as methodical, cautious, someone who triple-checked door locks and always told people exactly where she would be and for how long. She said Adrienne had been excited about the trip, not anxious or afraid. There had been no recent conflicts, no financial troubles, no romantic entanglements that might explain a sudden departure. Adrienne's phone records showed only routine calls in the days leading up to her trip, most of them to Botanical supply companies or her sister. Her bank account had not been accessed after November 17th. Her car, a 2006 Honda CR-V, remained parked at the cabin, keys still in the ignition, tank half full. Claire had also mentioned something that struck Kulick as significant now, though it had been dismissed as coincidence at the time. Adrienne had called her the morning of November 18th, the day after she arrived, using the landline inside the cabin because there was no cell service. She told Claire the place was perfect, quiet, and beautiful, but she also said something odd. She said she felt like someone had been near the cabin recently, even though Vess had assured her no one else had rented it in over a month. When Claire asked what she meant, Adrienne said she had found fresh cigarette butts near the woodpile and a set of boot prints leading from the tree line to the back window, then disappearing into the brush. She hadn't sounded scared, just puzzled. Claire had told her to mention it to Vess, but there was no record that Adrienne ever did. Kulick made a note to locate Marlon Vess and interview him again. The original file showed Vess had been cooperative during the investigation, providing access to the cabin, rental records, and a list of previous guests dating back 3 years. He had no criminal history, No connection to Adrienne beyond the rental transaction, and an alibi for the days surrounding her disappearance. He had been in Traverse City attending a medical conference when she went missing, confirmed by hotel records and half a dozen witnesses. Still, Kulick wanted to ask him about the cigarette butts and the boot prints, details that seemed minor in 2009 but now felt like threads worth pulling. The forensic analysis of the messenger bag came back within a week. The lab confirmed that the pages inside matched the paper stock used in Adrienne's sketchbooks, several of which had been recovered from her apartment in Ann Arbor after she disappeared. The handwriting was verified as hers by a certified examiner who compared it against samples from her journals and work contracts. But the bag itself told a different story. Trace analysis found soil embedded in the leather strap, a composition consistent with the clay-rich earth found near riverbanks, rather than the sandy loam common around the cabin. There were also microscopic fibers, synthetic and dark blue, likely from a jacket or tarp, and on the interior lining, barely visible under UV light, were 3 small bloodstains. DNA testing was ordered immediately. While they waited for results, Kulick assembled a new search team. This time they wouldn't rely on assumptions about how far someone might wander or where a distressed person might logically go. This time they would follow the evidence backward from where the bag was found. The Toth brothers had discovered it roughly 4 miles north-northeast of the cabin, in a section of forest that had been outside the original search perimeter. The area was dense with undergrowth, crossed by seasonal streams that flooded in spring and froze solid in winter. It was not a place someone would stumble into by accident. It was deliberate terrain, the kind you entered only if you knew where you were going, or if someone led you there. Kulick requested ground-penetrating radar and a cadaver dog unit. He also contacted a forensic anthropologist from Michigan State University named Dr. Lillian Schott, who specialized in cold case recoveries in wilderness settings. Schott agreed to consult and arrived in Honor on March the 2nd, bringing with her a team of graduate students trained in systematic excavation techniques. They established a base camp a half-mile from the site where the bag had been found, using topographic maps and weather data from 2009 to model likely paths of travel and deposition. The snow that year had been heavy, and spring flooding would have shifted smaller objects downstream or buried them under sediment. The bag's location suggested it had been carried by runoff at some point, possibly multiple times over the years, before finally lodging against a submerged root system where the Toth brothers found it. On March 9th, the cadaver dog, a German shepherd named Rue, alerted near a collapsed section of riverbank about 60 yards west of the bag site. The soil there was unstable, eroded by seasonal flooding and shaded by a thick canopy of hemlock that kept the ground frozen longer than surrounding areas. Schott's team began a careful excavation, removing dirt in thin layers and sifting every handful through mesh screens. On the second day, they found a piece of fabric, gray wool, still intact despite a decade of exposure. It matched the description of the coat Adrienne had been wearing in the security footage. Then came a button, stamped with a small cardinal emblem, identical to the one on the knit cap she had purchased weeks before her trip. By the 4th day, they had uncovered fragments of bone, small sections of a human radius, and ulna, buried 18 inches beneath the surface. The bones showed no signs of animal scavenging, which Schott noted was unusual, but not impossible given the depth and the frozen conditions. Dental records were requested from Adrienne's family, though everyone involved knew the identification was only a formality. The DNA from the bloodstains on the messenger bag had already come back. Mitochondrial analysis confirmed a maternal lineage match to Claire Wintall. The bones belonged to Adrienne. The recovery site was photographed, mapped, and secured. Schott spent an additional week at the location, searching for any other remains or personal effects. They found a broken wristwatch, its face cracked and hands frozen at 11:43, though whether that was AM or PM, and on which day, would remain unknown. They also found something else, something that shifted the entire trajectory of the investigation. Buried 3 feet from the bone fragments, wrapped in a deteriorated plastic bag, was a folding knife. The blade was rusted, the handle cracked, but still identifiable as a lockback design commonly sold at hardware stores and sporting goods shops across the Midwest. There were no fingerprints recoverable after so many years in the ground, but forensic analysis found microscopic traces of blood on the hinge, blood that matched Adrienne's DNA profile. Kulick stood at the edge of the excavation site on a cold March afternoon, watching Schott's team work with brushes and trowels, each movement careful and reverent. He thought about the search in 2009, about the hundreds of people who had walked these woods believing they were looking for someone lost. Now he understood they had been looking for something else entirely. Adrienne Wintall hadn't wandered into the forest and succumbed to the cold. She had been brought here, and whoever brought her had been close enough to know she was alone, patient enough to wait until no one was watching, and careful enough to nearly get away with it for 10 years. The knife changed everything. Within 48 hours of its discovery, Detective Kulick had photographs of the blade sent to every sporting goods store, hardware supplier, and outdoor outfitter within a 100-mile radius of Honor. The manufacturer was identified as Timber Ridge, a mid-tier brand sold primarily through regional chains in the Midwest. The model, a 4-inch lockback with a rubber grip, had been in production from 2005 to 2011, which meant thousands of them had passed through cash registers across Michigan during that window. But it was a starting point, and Kulick had learned over 15 years in law enforcement that cases this cold didn't break from single pieces of evidence. They fractured slowly, under pressure applied to the right stress points. He returned to the original case file and began re-interviewing everyone connected to Adrienne's final days. Marlon Vess was first. The retired surgeon was now 73, living in a ranch-style home on the outskirts of Frankfurt with his second wife, a former surgical nurse named Patrice. Kulick arrived unannounced on a Thursday morning in late March, the kind of gray day where the sky and the lake bled into each other without a visible horizon. Vess answered the door in a cardigan and reading glasses, surprised but cooperative. They sat in a sunroom overlooking a dormant garden, and Kulick asked him to walk through November 2009 one more time. Vess repeated what he had told investigators a decade earlier. He had been in Traverse City for a medical conference from November 16th through November 23rd. He had not seen Adrienne in person, only corresponded with her through a single phone call to confirm the reservation and arrange key pickup. She had left cash in an envelope under the doormat as agreed, and he had not returned to the cabin until the morning he found her missing. When Kulick asked about the cigarette butts and boot prints Adrienne had mentioned to her sister, Vess frowned. He said he had no idea who might have been near the property. The cabin was remote, but hunters occasionally cut through the area despite posted signs. He himself didn't smoke and never had. Kulick pressed further. Had anyone else expressed interest in the cabin around that time? Had Vess mentioned to anyone locally that a woman would be staying there alone? Vess hesitated, then said he might have mentioned it casually at the Honor General Store when he posted the rental notice, but he couldn't remember who might have been present. The store was a communal hub where locals gathered for coffee and gossip, especially in the off-season when tourists thinned out. Kulick made a note and asked one final question. Did Vess own a Timber Ridge lockback knife? Vess said no. He preferred fixed-blade hunting knives, and pulled one from a drawer in the kitchen to show him. It was a completely different style, an heirloom from his father. Kulick thanked him and left, but something about the conversation nagged at him. Not suspicion of Vess himself, but the realization that Adrienne's presence at the cabin had not been as private as she might have believed. Small towns had long memories and shorter distances. Information traveled. The next person on Kulick's list was Darlene Kopp, the cashier who had seen Adrienne at Beulah Fuel and Feed. She still worked there, running the morning shift 6 days a week. Kulick found her behind the counter ringing up a customer's lottery tickets and cigarettes. When the store emptied, he introduced himself and asked if she remembered Adrienne. Darlene nodded immediately. She said she thought about that girl every winter when the first snow came. She described Adrienne as polite, soft-spoken, someone who seemed content to be alone, but not lonely. Kulick asked if anyone else had been in the store that afternoon, anyone who might have noticed Adrienne or overheard where she was staying. Darlene thought for a moment, then said there had been a few regulars. Old Mr. Fenster buying pipe tobacco, a couple of ice fishermen grabbing bait, and Travis Lorn, who had been standing near the firewood display, stacking split logs into bundles for sale. Travis Lorn. Kulick wrote the name down. Darlene continued, saying Travis worked odd jobs around the area, maintenance, landscaping, snow removal in winter. He was quiet, kept to himself, but reliable. She thought he still lived somewhere near Platte Lake, though she hadn't seen him in the store recently. Kulick asked if Travis smoked. Darlene said yes, roll your owns, the cheap kind. Kulick returned to his office and ran a background check on Travis Allen Lorn, age 46, born and raised in Benzie County. No major criminal record, just a few minor infractions. A drunk and disorderly charge in 2003, dismissed. A citation for trespassing on state land in 2007, paid fine. A suspended driver's license in 2012 for unpaid child support, later reinstated. Lorn's last known address was a rental property on the south shore of Platte Lake, less than 2 miles from the cabin where Adrienne had stayed. Kulick felt his pulse quicken. He pulled satellite images of the area from 2009. and cross-referenced them with the search perimeter maps. Lorn's residence had been just outside the original boundary, close enough to walk to the cabin through the woods in under 30 minutes. He called the property management company listed on the rental records and learned that Lorn had lived there from 2008 until 2014, when he stopped paying rent and vacated without notice. The landlord said Lorn had been a problematic tenant, frequently late on payments, occasionally hosting loud gatherings despite a no-parties clause. When asked if Lorn owned any vehicles, the landlord recalled an old Ford pickup, brown or rust-colored, and a snowmobile he kept under a tarp behind the house. Kulick requested a deeper search of county records and discovered that Lorn had filed for bankruptcy in 2015. The court documents listed his assets at the time, including tools, a generator, camping equipment, and several knives, though no specific brands were mentioned. More importantly, the filing included a forwarding address in Traverse City, a boarding house on 11th Street. Kulick drove there the next morning. The boarding house was a converted Victorian with peeling paint and a chain-link fence around the yard. The manager, a woman named Shelley Urbanski, said Travis Lorn had rented a room on the second floor from 2015 to 2017 but left abruptly after an argument with another tenant. She didn't have a current address but said he had mentioned working at a marina in Sutton's Bay, doing boat maintenance and dock repairs. Kulick thanked her and made the 20-minute drive north. The marina manager confirmed that Lorn had worked there seasonally for the past 2 years, but had not shown up for the start of the 2019 season. He was considered unreliable and would not be rehired. When Kulick asked if anyone knew where Lorn lived now, one of the dock workers said he thought Travis was staying in a camper somewhere in the state forest, moving around to avoid park fees, the kind of guy who knew the back roads and hidden clearings where rangers didn't patrol. Kulick returned to Honor and convened a meeting with the Benzie County Sheriff, the Michigan State Police detective assigned to assist, and Dr. Schott, who had remained in the area to consult on the investigation. He laid out what he had learned. Travis Lorn was present at the store where Adrienne was last seen. He lived within walking distance of the cabin. He smoked cigarettes. He knew the woods intimately, and he had a history of financial instability and minor legal trouble, the profile of someone who might operate on the margins, unnoticed. Schott pointed out that the recovery site where Adrienne's remains were found required local knowledge. It wasn't a random dumping ground. It was deliberate, a location chosen by someone familiar with seasonal flooding patterns, someone who understood how the landscape would conceal evidence over time. The sheriff authorized a warrant to search any property associated with Lorn and to bring him in for questioning. But first, they had to find him. Kulick coordinated with the Department of Natural Resources and obtained access to their database of hunting and fishing licenses. Lorn had purchased a small game license in October 2018, listing a P.O. box in Interlochen as his mailing address. Kulick visited the post office and learned the box had been closed for non-payment 6 months earlier, but the clerk remembered Lorn. She described him as gaunt, weathered, often wearing a blue canvas work jacket and a camouflage cap. She said he always paid in cash and rarely made eye contact. On April 10th, a DNR officer patrolling near the Betsy River reported seeing a camper matching the description parked in an unauthorized clearing off a fire access road. Kulick mobilized a team and arrived at the location just before dawn. The camper was a rusted Winnebago from the late 1980s, tilted on uneven ground, surrounded by tarps, firewood, and plastic bins. Smoke rose from a makeshift fire pit. Kulick approached with 2 deputies and knocked on the camper door. No answer. He knocked again and identified himself. After a long silence, the door opened. Travis Lorn stood in the doorway, barefoot and unshaven, wearing thermal underwear and the same blue canvas jacket the postal clerk had described. His eyes were tired, but not surprised. Kulick said they needed to talk about November 2009. Lorn stared at him for a moment, then nodded slowly. He said he had been waiting for this conversation for a very long time. Travis Lorn sat in the interview room at the Benzie County Sheriff's Office for 3 hours before he spoke more than 10 words. He had waived his right to an attorney, a decision that made Kulick both hopeful and uneasy. Suspects who waived counsel were either innocent and eager to clear their names, or guilty and convinced they were smarter than the detectives across the table. Lorn seemed to be neither. He sat with his hands folded, staring at the grain of the wooden table, occasionally lifting his eyes to the two-way mirror, as if he could see through it to the other side. Kulick began with the basics. Where had Lorn been on the evening of November 19, 2009? Lorn said he didn't remember specific dates from that long ago, but he knew he had been living near Platte Lake at the time, working whatever jobs he could find. Snow removal mostly, clearing driveways for elderly residents and small businesses in Honor and Beulah. Kulick asked if he remembered a woman named Adrienne Wintall. Lorn's jaw tightened. He said yes, he remembered her. Not personally, but from the news and the search efforts. Everyone in the area knew about her disappearance. Kulick slid a photograph across the table, the security footage still from Beulah Fuel and Feed showing Adrienne at the counter with Lorn visible in the background near the firewood display. Lorn glanced at it and nodded. He said he had been there that day, stacking wood for Darlene, a side job she paid him $20 for whenever shipments came in. He didn't remember interacting with Adrienne or even noticing her specifically. Kulick leaned forward. You were standing 6 feet from her for at least 4 minutes according to the timestamp. You're telling me you didn't see her, didn't hear where she was going, didn't pay any attention at all? Lorn's expression didn't change. He said the store was always busy, people came and went. He focused on his work because Darlene was strict about how the wood needed to be stacked. Kulick switched tactics. He asked about the cigarette butts found near the cabin where Adrienne stayed. Lorn smoked roll-your-owns. Had he been near that property around that time? Lorn hesitated, then said he might have been. He used to walk through the state forest at night when he couldn't sleep, following old logging trails and deer paths. It was possible he passed near the cabin at some point, but he didn't remember seeing anyone there. Kulick pressed harder. So you admit you were in the area? You admit you knew the woods? You admit you saw Adrienne at the store the day she arrived, and now we've found her remains less than 2 miles from where you were living, along with a knife that matches a brand sold at every hardware store you likely shopped at. Lorn's hands unclenched, then clenched again. He looked directly at Kulick for the first time. I didn't kill her. The words hung in the air. Kulick asked, then what did you do? Lorn closed his eyes. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost resigned. He said he had seen Adrienne at the cabin, not just once, but twice. The first time was the evening she arrived, around dusk. He had been walking through the woods and noticed lights on in a cabin that was usually dark. He stopped at the tree line and watched for a few minutes. Curious who had rented the place, he saw her through the window, unpacking, moving around the small kitchen. He didn't approach, just watched, then continued his walk. The second time was the following night. He had returned to the same area, not for any particular reason, just habit. He said he liked the quiet near the river, the way the snow muffled everything. He saw her again, this time standing on the porch, smoking a cigarette. He was surprised because she hadn't looked like a smoker in the store. He stayed in the shadows, watching. After a few minutes, she went back inside and locked the door. He heard the deadbolt turn. He stayed outside for a while longer, maybe 20 minutes, just standing there in the dark. Then he left. Kulick felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. You're admitting you stalked her? Lorn shook his head. I wasn't stalking. I was just there. There's a difference. Kulick asked why he had never come forward during the search. Lorn said he was scared. He knew how it would look. A man with no stable income, a history of minor trouble, admitting he had been near the cabin where a woman disappeared. He said he almost turned himself in a dozen times during those first few weeks, but the longer he waited, the harder it became. Eventually the search ended and he convinced himself it didn't matter. She was gone, and nothing he said would bring her back. Kulick asked if he owned a Timber Ridge lockback knife. Lorn said he used to. He bought one at a hardware store in Traverse City in 2007 or 2008, used it for gutting fish and cutting rope, but he lost it somewhere in the woods in 2010 or 2011. He couldn't remember exactly when or where. The interview continued for another hour, circling the same questions from different angles. Lorn's story never changed, but it also never expanded. He admitted to being near the cabin, to watching Adrienne, to owning a knife like the one found at the recovery site, but he insisted he never spoke to her, never touched her, never harmed her. Kulick suspended the interview and consulted with the prosecutor's office. The evidence was circumstantial: presence near the scene, ownership of a common type of knife, suspicious behavior. But no physical evidence directly linked Lorn to Adrienne's death. No DNA on the knife handle, no fibers from his clothing, no witnesses placing him at the cabin on the night she disappeared. The prosecutor said they needed more before filing charges. Kulick returned to the interview room and told Lorn he was free to go but should not leave the area. Lorn stood slowly, his shoulders slumped. Before he reached the door, he turned back. He said there was something else, something he hadn't mentioned because he wasn't sure it mattered. The second night he was near the cabin, the night he saw Adrienne on the porch, he wasn't alone in the woods. He had heard someone else moving through the trees, east of where he was standing, footsteps crunching through snow, deliberate, not the random wandering of an animal. He assumed it was another hiker or maybe a hunter, so he stayed quiet and eventually left. But later, After Adrienne disappeared, he wondered if that person had stayed when he left. Kulick felt his pulse spike. "Did you see who it was?" Lorn shook his head. It was too dark, and they were too far away. But he remembered one detail. Whoever it was had a light, a small flashlight or maybe a headlamp, because he saw a brief flicker of it through the trees before it went dark. Kulick asked why he hadn't mentioned this 10 years ago. Lorn said the same reason he hadn't mentioned anything else: fear, self-preservation, stupidity, pick one. He left the building and Kulick stood alone in the hallway, his mind racing. If Lorn was telling the truth, and that was still a significant if, then someone else had been near the cabin the night Adrienne was last seen alive. Someone with a light, someone who knew the area well enough to move through it in darkness. Kulick returned to his office and pulled up the original search records. He cross-referenced volunteers, deputies, and property owners within a 5-mile radius. Then he opened a separate file, one he had been building quietly over the past 2 weeks. It contained background checks on everyone who had regular access to the forest around the cabin: hunters with seasonal permits, guides who led tourists on snowshoe treks, maintenance workers for the state park, and one name that kept appearing in multiple contexts: a forest ranger named Carl Hustis. Hustis had worked for the Michigan Department of Natural Resources since 1998. He was assigned to the Platte River State Forest District, which included the area where Adrienne's remains were found. He had participated in the original search efforts in 2009, logging more volunteer hours than almost anyone else. He knew the terrain intimately, every trail, every seasonal creek, every hidden clearing. And according to personnel records, he had taken a 2-week personal leave starting November 20th, 2009, just 3 days after Adrienne arrived at the cabin. The reason given was a family emergency, but no details were documented. Kulick picked up the phone and called the DNR headquarters in Lansing. He requested Hustis's current assignment and was told the ranger had retired in 2017 after nearly 20 years of service. His last known address was in Benzonia, a small village 12 miles south of Honor. Kulick thanked the clerk and hung up. He sat in silence for a moment, staring at the map of the forest pinned to his wall. Then he grabbed his jacket and keys. It was time to talk to the man who knew these woods better than anyone. Carl Hustis lived in a modest bungalow on the edge of Benzonia, surrounded by birch trees and a split-rail fence that needed repair. Kulick arrived just before sunset, the sky streaked with orange and purple. Hustis answered the door wearing flannel and slippers, a mug of coffee in one hand. He was in his early 60s, broad-shouldered, with a neatly trimmed gray beard and the kind of weathered face that came from decades working outdoors. He recognized Kulick immediately and invited him inside without hesitation. They sat in a small living room cluttered with field guides, topographic maps, and framed photographs of forests in different seasons. Kulick explained that he was reviewing the Adrienne Wintall case and wanted to ask a few follow-up questions. Hustis nodded. He said he remembered the case well. It had been one of the most intensive searches he had ever participated in, and the lack of closure had bothered him for years. Kulick asked about the personal leave Hustis had taken in November 2009. Hustis frowned, as if trying to recall something from a distant memory. He said his mother had fallen ill, pneumonia, and he had driven to Ohio to help his sister care for her. She recovered, but it had been touch and go for a few days. Kulick made a note and asked if Hustis had been in the area before he left for Ohio. Hustis said yes. He had been part of the initial search grid on November 22nd, the day after Adrienne was reported missing. He had covered the southern quadrant near the river with a team of volunteers. Kulick asked if he had ever been near the cabin before that. Hustis hesitated just for a fraction of a second, then said he patrolled the area regularly as part of his duties. He was familiar with the property and had checked on it occasionally when it was vacant to make sure there were no issues with trespassing or vandalism. Kulick asked if he owned a timber ridge knife. Hustis stood and walked to a drawer in the kitchen. He returned with a folding knife, a timber ridge lockback identical to the one found at the recovery site. He said it was standard gear for rangers, useful for cutting rope, clearing brush, field dressing game. He had owned his for more than a decade. Kulick felt the room tilt slightly. He asked if Hustis had ever lost a knife in the woods. Hustis said no. He was careful with his equipment, but then he added, almost as an afterthought, that he had lent his knife to someone once, a volunteer during the search. He couldn't remember the name, but it had never been returned. The name came to Kulick 3 days later, buried in a volunteer sign-in sheet from November 24, 2009. The handwriting was hurried, barely legible, but the signature matched the description Carl Hustis had given. Owen Berridge, age listed as 34 at the time, local address in Honor, no phone number recorded. Kulick cross-referenced the name against county records and found a sparse file. Owen Berridge had lived in Honor from 2007 to 2011, renting a small house on the east side of town near the railroad tracks. Employment history showed sporadic work: dishwasher at a restaurant in Frankfurt, stock clerk at a hardware store in Beulah, seasonal labor for a Christmas tree farm outside Empire. No criminal record, no vehicle registered in his name, no property ownership. He had simply existed on the margins, the kind of person who moved through a community without leaving deep impressions. But there was one detail that caught Kulick's attention. In 2011, Barage had been issued a restraining order by a woman named Natalie Kress, also a resident of Honor. The court documents were minimal, filed under domestic dispute, but the order required Barage to stay at least 500 feet from Kress's home and workplace. It had been granted for 1 year and never renewed. Kulick tracked down Natalie Kress, who now lived in Manistee and worked as a dental hygienist. She agreed to meet him at a coffee shop near the harbor on a rainy April afternoon. Kress was in her early 40s, cautious but willing to talk. She said she had dated Owen Berridge briefly in 2010, maybe 3 or 4 months. At first he seemed quiet and harmless, but over time his behavior became unsettling. He would show up at her apartment unannounced, sometimes late at night, claiming he just wanted to make sure she was safe. He called her repeatedly, sometimes 20 or 30 times a day, leaving voicemails that ranged from affectionate to accusatory. When she tried to end the relationship, he refused to accept it. He would follow her to work, wait outside her building, leave notes on her car. She finally filed for the restraining order after he entered her apartment using a spare key she didn't know he had copied. Kulick asked if Barage had ever been violent. Kress said no, not physically, but there was something in the way he looked at her that made her afraid. She described it as obsessive, like he believed they were connected in a way that transcended normal boundaries. She said he talked often about loyalty and permanence, how most people were disloyal and temporary, but he wasn't. He told her once that if he ever truly cared about someone, he would never let them disappear from his life. The words made Kulick's skin prickle. He asked if Kress knew where Barage was now. She said she hadn't seen or heard from him since the restraining order expired in 2012. She assumed he had left the area, and she had been grateful for that. Kulick thanked her and returned to his car. He sat in the parking lot, rain drumming on the windshield, and made a series of calls. First to the Michigan State Police to run a full background search on Owen Berridge, then to the Social Security Administration to trace any employment or benefit records, then to the U.S. Postal Service to check for forwarding addresses. The results came back slowly over the next 48 hours, and they painted a picture of a man who had deliberately erased himself. After leaving Honor in 2011, Barage had worked briefly at a marina in Leland, then at a lumber mill in Buckley. Both employers described him as competent but strange, someone who rarely spoke and preferred to work alone. In 2013, his name appeared on a lease agreement for a trailer park in Kalkaska, but the landlord said he had been evicted after 6 months for disturbing other tenants. The complaints were vague: noises at odd hours, items moved from other people's porches, a general sense of unease. After that, the trail went cold. No employment records, no tax filings, no address updates. It was as if Owen Berridge had stepped off the grid entirely. But Kulick knew from experience that people who disappeared from official records didn't always disappear from the landscape. They found ways to survive, often in rural areas where cash work was common and questions were few. He contacted the DNR again and requested a list of all hunting and fishing licenses issued in northern Michigan over the past 5 years. The database returned more than 12,000 entries, but Kulick narrowed it by age, gender, and county of residence. One name appeared twice: Owen Berridge, age 44, small game license purchased in October 2018, mailing address listed as General Delivery, Interlochen, the same post office where Travis Lorn had maintained a box. Kulick drove to Interlochen and spoke with the postmaster, a man named Ed Kloss, who had worked there for 23 years. Kloss remembered Barage, though not fondly. He said Barage had used the general delivery service sporadically, picking up mail every few weeks. He was always polite but unnervingly quiet, and he never made small talk. Kloss said he stopped coming in around March 2019, and there were still a few pieces of unclaimed mail in the back. Kulick asked to see them. Kloss retrieved 2 envelopes, both addressed to Owen Berridge, both from state agencies. One was a renewal notice for his hunting license. The other was a notice of overdue payment for a campground permit issued by the DNR for a site near Interlochen State Park. Kulick called the park office and learned that the permit had been issued for a primitive campsite, Lot 14. located on the western edge of the park near a network of trails that connected to the larger state forest. The ranger who answered said the lot had been vacant for months, but she could send someone to check if he wanted. Kulick said he would check himself. He arrived at the campsite just before noon. Lot 14 was a small clearing surrounded by dense jack pine and scrub oak, accessible by a rutted dirt road that barely qualified as drivable. There was no vehicle present, no tent, no obvious signs of recent habitation, but as Kulick walked the perimeter, he began to notice details. A fire ring made from stacked stones, the ashes inside gray and compacted but not ancient. A piece of blue tarp tangled in the low branches of a tree, the same synthetic blue that had been found on Adrienne's messenger bag. A small cairn of rocks near the edge of the clearing, deliberate and unnatural. Kulick crouched beside the cairn and carefully dismantled it. Beneath the stones was a shallow depression in the dirt, and inside the depression was a mason jar, sealed with a metal lid. He lifted it out and held it up to the light. Inside were small objects, a button with a cardinal emblem, a fragment of gray wool fabric, a folded piece of paper, yellowed and brittle. Kulick's hands shook as he unscrewed the lid. The paper inside was a page torn from a sketchbook, the edges ragged. On it was a pencil drawing of a winterberry branch, delicate and precise, signed at the bottom in small script, A. Wintall. Kulick stood slowly, the jar still in his hand, and looked around the clearing with new eyes. This wasn't just a campsite, it was a shrine. He called for backup and a forensic team. Within 2 hours, the area was cordoned off and being processed like a crime scene. They found more hidden caches. Another mason jar containing a wristwatch with a cracked face, a third jar with a small lock of hair tied with string, and beneath a rotted log at the far edge of the clearing, they found a leather-bound journal wrapped in plastic. The journal belonged to Owen Berridge. The entries spanned from 2009 to 2019, written in a tight, obsessive hand. Most of it was mundane, weather observations, animal sightings, notes about trail conditions, but scattered throughout were passages that made Kulick's stomach turn. Entries about watching people, about studying their routines, about understanding what it meant to truly see someone. One entry from November 2009 read, "She doesn't know I'm here, but that's the point. To see without being seen is the purest form of understanding." Another entry, dated weeks later, was more direct. "The ranger lent me his knife. He doesn't know I'll never give it back. I don't need it for cutting rope." There were sketches in the margins, crude drawings of cabins, trees, human figures seen from a distance. And near the end of the journal, an entry from 2019. They found the bag. It was only a matter of time. "I thought the river would keep the secret, but rivers talk. I can hear them now, whispering her name." The forensic team photographed every page, cataloged every item, and transported everything back to the lab. Kulick requested an expedited analysis of the DNA on the fabric and hair samples. The results came back within a week. The hair matched Adrienne Wintall, the fabric matched her coat, and on the button they found a partial fingerprint that had survived a decade of exposure. The print was run through state and federal databases. It matched Owen Berridge, whose prints had been taken in 2011 as part of the restraining order process. Kulick now had physical evidence directly linking Barage to Adrienne's belongings. He had journal entries that documented stalking behavior and admitted possession of the knife found at the recovery site, and he had a pattern of obsessive conduct corroborated by a previous victim. The prosecutor's office authorized an arrest warrant, but first they had to find him. Kulick coordinated with the DNR, the state police, and the U.S. Forest Service to launch a coordinated search of the state forest. They focused on areas where someone could live off the grid, places with access to water, natural shelter, and minimal foot traffic. For 2 weeks, they found nothing. Then on May 3rd, a fire lookout tower operator near the Boardman River reported seeing smoke rising from a ravine that wasn't marked on any campsite map. A team hiked in and found a small lean-to constructed from salvaged lumber and tarps. Inside were supplies, canned food, a sleeping bag, a propane stove, and sitting on a stump outside the shelter, as if he had been waiting, was Owen Berridge. He didn't run. He didn't resist. When the officers approached, he simply stood and raised his hands. His face was gaunt, his hair long and matted, his clothing stained and torn. But his eyes were clear, almost calm. They placed him in handcuffs and read him his rights. On the hike back to the access road, one of the officers asked him why he hadn't run when he had the chance. Barage looked at him and said, "Because running only delays the inevitable. I learned that from her. She ran, and it didn't matter." The officer asked what he meant. Barage smiled faintly. He said, "She tried to leave the cabin that night. I saw her through the window, packing her bag, moving quickly. She was afraid. I could feel it even from outside. So I knocked. I wanted to tell her she didn't need to be afraid of me, but when she opened the door she looked at me like I was a monster, and I realized she was right. Owen Berridge's confession came in pieces, delivered over 3 days of recorded interviews in a secure room at the Michigan State Police post in Traverse City. He spoke without emotion, his voice flat and measured, as if he were describing someone else's life rather than his own. Detective Kulick sat across from him, a digital recorder running, a prosecutor and a court-appointed psychologist observing through the glass. Barage began with the night of November 19, 2009. He said he had been walking through the woods near the Platte River, a route he traveled often when insomnia kept him awake. He'd seen lights in the cabin and stopped to watch. Curious about who had rented the place, he saw Adrienne through the window, moving around the small kitchen, her silhouette framed against the warm glow of kerosene lamps. He said he felt drawn to her, not in a sexual way, but in a way he couldn't fully explain. She seemed solitary, self-contained, complete. He watched for nearly an hour before leaving. The next night, he returned. This time he moved closer, circling the cabin from different angles, studying the layout, the way she moved, the rhythm of her routine. He saw her step onto the porch to smoke a cigarette, and he was surprised because she hadn't seemed like someone who smoked. He stayed hidden in the tree line, motionless, barely breathing. When she went back inside and locked the door, he remained outside, standing in the snow, listening to the silence. He said he felt peaceful in those moments, like he was part of something larger than himself. But then he heard her moving inside, quickly, frantically. He heard drawers opening, the rustling of fabric, the sound of a zipper. He moved to the window and looked in. She was packing her bag, her hands shaking, her face pale. He realized she knew someone had been watching. Maybe she had seen him, or maybe she had simply felt it, the weight of unseen eyes. Either way, she was leaving, and the thought of her leaving, of her disappearing before he could understand why he felt connected to her, filled him with something he described as panic. He knocked on the door. He said he didn't plan to hurt her, he just wanted to talk, to explain that she didn't need to be afraid. But when she opened the door, just a crack, the chain still latched. She looked at him with an expression he would never forget. Not anger, not confusion, but pure primal fear. She tried to close the door, but he pushed against it, snapping the chain. He said he didn't remember making the decision to push. His body just moved. She stumbled backward, tripping over her suitcase, and he stepped inside. He told her to calm down, that he wasn't going to hurt her, but his words only seemed to terrify her more. She grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter, a small paring knife, and held it out in front of her, her hand trembling. He said he tried to take it from her gently, but she resisted, and in the struggle, the blade cut across his palm. The pain was sharp and immediate, and something inside him shifted. He wrenched the knife from her hand and struck her once hard across the side of her head with his closed fist. She collapsed. Barage paused here, his gaze distant. He said he stood over her for a long time, watching her breathe, watching the blood seep from a cut above her temple where she had hit the edge of the table on her way down. He said he knew in that moment that everything had changed, that there was no explaining this away, no returning to the version of himself that had existed 5 minutes earlier. He checked her pulse. She was alive but unconscious. He looked around the cabin, at her belongings, at the sketch on the table, at the life she had brought into this space. And he made a decision. He couldn't let her wake up and identify him. He couldn't risk the consequence of what he had done. So he carried her outside, into the cold and the dark, and he walked. He knew the forest well enough to navigate without a flashlight, and he moved quickly, his arms aching under her weight. She stirred once, murmuring something he couldn't make out, and he stopped to check if she was waking. She wasn't. He continued walking until he reached the riverbank, a place where the current ran fast enough to keep the water from freezing entirely. He laid her down on the snow-covered ground and searched his pockets. He found Carl Eustace's knife, the one the ranger had lent him weeks earlier during a trail maintenance project. He had never returned it. He said he didn't want to use the knife, but he couldn't leave her alive. If she survived the cold, she would tell the police what happened, and his life would be over. He told himself it was already over the moment he pushed through that door, and this was simply the logical conclusion. He opened the blade and knelt beside her. She opened her eyes then, just barely, and looked at him. She didn't scream, didn't fight, just looked at him with an expression he couldn't name. Resignation, maybe, or sadness. He pressed the blade to her throat, but his hand wouldn't move. He sat there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, frozen by indecision. Then she stopped breathing on her own. He checked for a pulse and found none. The cold had taken her while he hesitated. He said he felt relief and horror in equal measure. He hadn't killed her with the knife, but he had killed her by bringing her out into the frozen night, by taking away her chance to survive. He buried her in a shallow depression near the river, covering her body with snow and branches. He took her messenger bag, intending to dispose of it, but couldn't bring himself to throw it away. It felt like evidence of her existence, proof that she had been real. He kept it, along with small items he took from the cabin, a button, a piece of her coat, a page from her sketchbook. He said he visited the burial site dozens of times over the years, adding to it, moving things, trying to create something that felt like remembrance rather than concealment. Kulick asked why he had participated in the search efforts. Barage said it was the only way to stay close to the investigation, to know what the authorities were finding or not finding. He said it also felt like penance, a way to pretend he cared about bringing her home when he was the reason she was gone. When Carl Eustace asked to borrow a knife during the search, Barage realized he still had the ranger's blade in his coat pocket, the one he had almost used. He couldn't return it covered in his own blood from the cut on his palm, so he claimed he had lost it. Eustace didn't press the issue. Barage disposed of the knife months later, burying it near the site where he had left Adrienne, a symbolic gesture he couldn't fully explain. The forensic analysis confirmed Barage's account. The blood on the knife matched both Adrienne's DNA and Barage's, consistent with his description of the struggle. The fibers on the messenger bag matched clothing Barage had worn, documented in photographs from the 2009 search efforts. And the location of the remains aligned with his description of the burial site, later disturbed by seasonal flooding that carried some items downstream. On June 14, 2019, Owen Berridge was formally charged with second-degree murder, felony murder during the commission of a home invasion, and concealment of a death. He pleaded guilty to all charges as part of an agreement that spared him a trial. The plea hearing was brief. The judge asked if he understood the consequences of his plea, and Barage said yes. The judge asked if anyone had coerced or threatened him, and Barage said no. Then the judge asked if he had anything to say to the family of Adrienne Wintall, who sat in the front row of the courtroom. Claire with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her parents on either side of her. Barage turned to face them. He said, "I can't ask for forgiveness because I don't deserve it. I can only tell you that I think about her every day, and I will for the rest of my life. I'm sorry doesn't cover it, but I don't have better words." Claire stood. She looked at him for a long moment, her face expressionless, then spoke in a voice that was steady and clear. "You took my sister from us, but you don't get to keep her memory. That belongs to us." She sat back down, and the judge sentenced Barage to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Detective Kulick attended the sentencing but left before the press conference that followed. He drove back to Honor, past the general store and the gas station, past the turnoff to the cabin where Adrienne had spent her final night. He drove to the recovery site, now marked with a small wooden cross placed by Claire and her family. Someone had planted wildflowers around the base, their colors bright against the dark earth. He stood there for a long time, listening to the river move over the stones, thinking about all the ways a life could be interrupted, all the ways a person could vanish and still leave echoes. Claire had told him privately after the hearing that she didn't feel closure, not in the way people talked about it on television. She said she felt something quieter, more like acknowledgement. Her sister's story had an ending now, and the truth, however painful, was better than the silence that had come before. Kulick returned to his office and filed his final report. In it, he wrote that the case had been solved not through a single breakthrough, but through the accumulation of small truths, each one leading to the next, each one requiring someone to pay attention. He noted that Adrienne Wintall had been failed by proximity, by the assumption that danger lived far away rather than in the quiet spaces between neighbors. But she had also been honored by persistence, by the refusal of her family and investigators to let her name fade into the list of the forgotten. On a cold morning in November 2019, exactly 10 years after Adrienne disappeared, a memorial service was held in honor. More than 200 people attended, filling the small community center beyond capacity. Claire spoke about her sister's love of plants, her meticulous illustrations, her quiet humor. A local choir sang, and a retired teacher read a poem about winter and remembrance. At the end of the service, attendees were invited to light candles and place them on a table beneath a photograph of Adrienne, the one from the security footage where she waved at the camera, her face open and unafraid. The candles burned long into the evening, small flames against the gathering dark, proof that even in the coldest season, light could still be carried forward. Make sure you subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates true crime stories. Your support helps bring attention to cases that might otherwise be forgotten. What cold case do you think deserves more attention? Comment below. Every unsolved case represents a family still waiting for answers, still hoping for the closure that finally came to the Martinez family after nearly half a century of searching.